I like the music being piped in. It's a nice touch. Because what else would you want except calming music, as having had Dave Scott kind of level set the threat stream, reminding us of groups like 764, which are extolling children to kill people and recruit them online to murder house pets. You know, the theme of this week, it's being really dangerous to be a house pet around here. I mean, between the debates and terrorists, it's... sorry, we have to stay on track here. Focus now. Our next panel is the other thing you really want to begin every day with to brighten your week, which is hatred in the homeland, domestic extremism and political violence. And we're really lucky to have Elizabeth Neumann, who the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at DHS and Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot. And she'll be joined by Dr. Michael Kenney, Director of the Matthew Ridgway Center and Professor of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, Darrell Johnson, the founder of DT Analytics, Jacob Ware, Research Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Dr. Julia Ebner, leader of Violent Extremism Lab, University of Oxford, and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Let's welcome our panel.
Well, good morning. Oh, good morning. Thank you. That's much better. I expect a lot from this crowd. My name is Elizabeth Neumann. It's my great pleasure to be able to moderate this discussion. I usually have to answer the questions. It's a lot of fun to get to ask the questions. But I want to put this into a little bit of context. The speaker we just heard from the FBI talked about racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, talked about militia and the anti-government extremism, and I was a part of the policy group that decided that those were the definitions we were going to use in the federal government. This was during the Trump administration. It's amazing how long government spends trying to come up with definitions. And that might have been one of the primary things during the Trump administration we were able to do, was just get the definitions down on paper, which was not a good thing. We needed to be doing more. But the way we're going to talk about it today is different. We're going to talk about far right and far left. And in some ways, I appreciate why our government doesn't use those definitions. But if you speak to the academic community and, quite frankly, our international counterparts overseas, that terminology tends to be much more widely used. So one of the reasons for that is because it is easier to see as a whole the differences between these different movements. And we're going to hear from our panelists why even some of our labels might not matter as much as they used to. So with that little primer, I want to get started, and I actually want to turn to you, Jacob, and ask you. You just co-authored a book on the problem of domestic terrorism, particularly the far right side of domestic terrorism. And I do think, because I contributed to this problem when I came into government back after having a hiatus of 5 years. I showed up at DHS in 2017. We were hyper-focused on defeating ISIS, and Charlottesville happened, and I turned to our intel analysts and said, what is this? What does this mean? Is this new? And for a variety of reasons, including something that I'll pull out of Darrell here in a little bit, they couldn't answer that question for me because they hadn't been looking at it. And so we grappled for a while, trying to figure out what was this thing we were seeing that eventually manifested in a spate of attacks in 2018 and 2019. And Jacob, my question to you is, how would you answer that question? Is what we saw in 2017, 2018, and 2019 new?
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the question. Thank you for moderating our panel. Thank you to Mr. Soufan for the invite. It's an honor to be here in New York, at this location especially, at this moment to discuss this important issue. I would answer it, no, it's not new. And let me divide that answer into two categories, strategic and ideological. So strategically speaking, in terms of the violence that we're seeing now, no, it's not new. It has its roots in several kind of key texts and key ideas from the historical movements. Now, in our book, in our work, we trace the key moment being the 1978 publication of a book called The Turner Diaries, which really kind of outlined the strategy of what you might call accelerationism, or the concept that a small act of violence can inspire some kind of broader conflagration. We also point, of course, to the 1983 and then 1992 publication of essays on a concept called leaderless resistance, which is this idea of inspiring lone actor acts of violence outside of formal organizations. You see those strategies in the wave of violence that we see over the past kind of 10 years in places like Charleston, Pittsburg, El Paso, Buffalo, Jacksonville. Let me briefly talk about the ideological point as well, because I think that's really important. It's very important to me. What I would say, Elizabeth, is especially on the Charlottesville point, it's not new because, of course, Charlottesville is all about a white supremacist cause that goes to the very roots of our country and its founding. Frederick Douglass, a hero of my hometown, Washington, D.C., in his last speech that he delivered in his life, he reflected on the reasons why he felt black men were being lynched in the South during the Reconstruction era. And the three things he came to were black men were being lynched to protect white communities from race riots. He said black men were lynched to protect white women from being raped. And he said black men were being lynched to protect the white vote. When you look at those three ideas, race riots, protection of rape, and protection of the white vote, you see all of those ideas in today's manifestos, in today's ideology. Just the other day in a presidential debate, one of the candidates hinted at a narrative now spreading like wildfire on Twitter, which is Democrats are importing voters from Latin America, from Central America, to steal an election. That is a Reconstruction era Great Replacement theory trope. And so it is absolutely not new, neither in strategy or ideology. These ideas go to the very root of our country.
So if it's not new, Jacob, what would you say is different about the present moment we find ourselves in?
I mean, that's the question we're trying to answer. Let me point to three things. First is social media, of course. Social media has lowered the barriers to entry, I think both kind of ideologically again and tactically. So we are seeing people now acting alone with less training, with less coherent ideologies. I think that's all an impact of social media. Two is this cover that's been given by mainstream politicians with the rhetoric that they are using, excusing, I would say, violence. So rhetoric like there's going to be a bloodbath, find people on both sides, stand back and stand by. I understand that one of the candidates wants to claim that that's all a hoax. If you look at the conversations that these individuals are having in these social media spaces, they are taking those cues, whether it's intended or not, whether we want to excuse it or not. So when somebody says there is going to be a bloodbath if we lose this election, the people in the movement, the people who would cause that bloodbath, they are taking that cue on board. The third thing I would say, probably the most controversial, is guns. The reality is, in conversations like this, I think we're always talking about how to get intent to violence down, right? Counterterrorism analysts think of threats as intent, capability, opportunity. If we live in a country where capability is always 100, that means intent has to be 0, or we're going to see some kind of violence. And intent is not 0. And so unless we can make progress on the capability question, which frankly means arms control of some kind, we're not going to get to a place where we can have sustainable, peaceful communities.
Julia, what does this look like overseas? What does the far right, are there differences between what we're experiencing here in the US and And can you tell us a little bit about how you're starting to see interaction between far-right and Salafi jihadist movements?
Really relevant questions. Yes, thanks for the reminder. Yeah, really relevant questions. And I would say that what we see overseas, well, capability luckily is not 100, but it's definitely there. And I think it's increasing also with things like homemade weapons, of course, also the manuals that circulate on social media, and also 3D printers, new technologies that allow you to basically create your own weapons. But yes, the intent is certainly there, and it's growing really fast. And I think Europe being in a sort of crisis on several levels also is contributing to that. What we see is a form of collective learning across the international far-right landscape. And I think it's interesting because already in the run-up to the 2016 elections where Trump was voted into power, we of course saw the alt-right really gain prominence on an international level. And then what happened was that the far-right, the new right in Europe, essentially copied and imitated some of the tactics that the alt-right had used. And now there's this cross-inspiration happening between the European far-right, which has exported some of its ideological pillars, some of the European Nouvelle Droite ideas of grand remplacement, the great replacement idea, which then turned into something that was really quite, well, providing an intellectual backbone. Of course, that's has a much older tradition, as Jacob mentioned, but this new version of it was definitely picked up by the American far-right, and then also turned into this idea of a white genocide or of the great replacement. And on the other hand, the European far-right, as I said, really managed to import some of the tactics that the US alt-right had used very effectively to run campaigns on scale, hybrid campaigns that are both involve an offline kind of media stunt, something like the Charlottesville rally. We saw something very similar actually now with the UK far-right riots, where just a piece of, in this case, a piece of disinformation spread like wildfire on social media and mobilized people into the streets, where the far-right was able to tap into different corners of its sympathizers and audiences. Because traditionally the far-right in the UK and also in other countries, including in the US, is very splintered, I would say. There are various different factions. And I think what's happening now is that they are able to galvanize a lot of people from different corners of the far-right, as well as sympathizing audiences who might just see themselves as concerned citizens, into joining for the cause, into joining around strategic rallying points. Like, of course, now the US election, the upcoming election, will be a very strong strategic point that can be used for such a mobilization. But we saw the same thing after the previous election with the Capitol riots, where again, there was a very similar dynamic as now with the UK riots, where disinformation spread, especially the election fraud narratives and conspiracy myths like QAnon that played a role, as well as the great replacement idea, that played a role, at least based on the University of Chicago's research, in the mindsets of a lot of the people who joined, most of which were not coming from any affiliation with militia movements or with extremist movements. They were basically loose sympathizers of the overall far-right, or radical Trump supporters. And that's something that we also now saw in the UK and also in the context of other countries, that they're increasingly able to bring together people from various different backgrounds, both traditional far-right movements, as well as newer audiences that just join off the back of a disinformation campaign, or because their frustrations are being highlighted and exploited. And I think that creates a much bigger problem that's on a much bigger scale, because of course it allows for things like thousands of people going into the streets, vandalizing, and even setting fire to hotels, like we saw in the UK, to hotels that host migrants, or people storming the Capitol. I think these are events that happen on such a scale that we probably would have not seen such a strong mobilization in a relatively quick period of time, especially now in the UK. We saw this happened within a few hours. And that's also because we have this very interactive social media ecosystem, an alternative information ecosystem that the far-right has been able to build up in their relevant countries, but also on an international level, where there is also a recycling of existing memes and existing campaign materials that are then repurposed and tailored for their specific country's context and for their audiences. So I think this is all quite worrying, but yeah, I maybe just a few final remarks, but in 2017, when I was doing the research for my book, Going Dark, I joined a whole range of different far-right extremist movements, and I went undercover with, for example, the organizers of the Charlottesville rally in the run-up to that rally, as well as with QAnon, back then a really small movement. So I could really now see in the last few years these movements grow, and having been on the inside at their very early stages, I find it mind-blowing. I'm almost lacking the words to describe how shocking it is to see them grow on such an international scale, and also in terms of the volume that they've reached, or the masses that they've been able to inspire. And I don't think it's the ideologies, but we'll get back to that later, I guess. But I think there's something more on a group cohesion level, on a group dynamics level, and on a social level that we need to investigate further.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to shift over to far left. And I think everybody in this room is very aware of the fact that, at least in the United States, lethality is coming from the far right. Because we have to defend that so frequently to the American public who might not have the context that we offer, we sometimes might kind of ignore the far left. And so Michael, my question for you, you've been studying the far left since 2017, particularly the anti-fascist movement and the anarchist movement. What do we need to know? What do we need to be paying attention to? And in particular, I'm very curious, how has it shifted over the last few years? Is it still something we don't, it's not that big of a deal, or do we need to be paying attention that there might be a shift there too?
Great question. Great question. First off, I want to thank Ali Soufan and Colin Clark for the opportunity to be with you. It's always a great day to be able to talk about these important issues. But I also want to give a shout out to the Soufan team, Clara, Haley. There's like a small army of people that have just made this such a great event. So I wanted to thank them as well. When I talk about the far left in the United States and in Europe, I just want to be clear. I'm not talking about the eco guys. I'm not talking about the black nationalists. I'm talking about the people that I've done research on, which is anti-fascists and anarchists. Did some field work, as you mentioned, starting in 2017, and since then have stayed in touch with a small number of respondents. These are militant, self-identified militant anti-fascists who are committed to violence in some circumstances, and then there are also anarcho-communists, but I won't go into that part. Okay, so Biden gets elected, and unlike we were seeing in some circles, these guys were not thrilled at that, right? They are not Biden supporters by any stretch. They don't believe in democracy at all. Where I live, Pennsylvania, there's a lot of anti-fascists and anarchists, and I'm having some interesting conversations with them about, are you going to vote in November? Because they don't want Trump coming back, but they don't want to vote for Kamala either. So, because they fundamentally do not believe in our electoral system. And for them to vote is acknowledging the legitimacy of Gaza. And this is what has rejuvenated the far left, the anti-fascists and the anarchists in the United States, is the devastation of Gaza. Frankly, it's given them a cause to latch onto, to organize around, and to reconstitute their networks. So they're back up, they're running. Most of what they do is in the way of peaceful protests, confrontational, in your face, say provocative things. The violence associated with these folks tends to be very organic and spontaneous. You know, a few years ago, it was, you see Proud Boys at a protest, okay, little scrum, little fisticuffs. That has the potential to spiral into a riot. These days, it's, okay, we're at a protest, and we see some Jewish counter-protesters. Okay, oh, okay, I'm gonna go after them. Same dynamic, just a different immediate tactical target. Now, the other interesting thing here is what's gonna happen if Trump wins. And I've been talking with a small number of militant anti-fascists about this possibility. And it could get pretty, for lack of a better word, interesting if that happens. That's because they are convinced that the first thing a new Trump administration will do is effectively hunt them down. That Trump sees them as the existential threat. And he will come after them. So they are currently, at least according to my sources, and take it with a grain of salt, they're preparing for that eventuality. For some, that will involve leaving the country, going to Canada. But for others, it will involve making a personal decision on whether they want to escalate. Not just direct action, they've always been doing direct action, but direct action to another level. And so I think that if Trump is reelected, we will see a similar dynamic that we saw in 2017. His first election, it just galvanized the movement. We saw that in 2017. These days we talk about J6. Well, remember J20, right? That was their J6, J20. They came to DC, big protests, got violent, bunch of people rounded up, prosecuted, right? That J20 is what they talk about. They're convinced that they will be hunted down, and they are preparing for that possibility.
That's rather ominous. Thank you for bringing that forward. Daryl, I can't help but think about the infamous piece of analysis that you drafted 15 years ago in 2009, which was warning about domestic terrorism, far-right domestic terrorism, and had the misfortune of becoming politicized, which kind of shut down the ability, at least at DHS, to focus on domestic terrorism for quite some time. And I am wondering, as you're looking at the moment that we find ourselves in, there is more attention now on the far right. We've heard from a number of government officials who are doing great work to try to use the tools that they have to address it. What are we missing, though? What's the thing that we should be planning for, working to get the right tools in place to protect against? What are we missing?
So I think two of our guests have kind of alluded to it. The first thing, on the far right, what we're missing is the fact that these extreme ideologies that I once saw on neo-Nazi KKK websites have been mainstreamed into the political apparatus of the country. I'm also very fearful of what's called infiltrators or insider threat from the far right. I've written a policy paper about that. You can find it at New Lines Institute. Not only has the far right infiltrated at a local level at our school board meetings, our county councils, things like that, there was a study done on state delegates infiltrating, and we had something like 18% of state delegates have a far right conspiracy views, have been supporting far-right groups like white supremacists, militia groups, things like that. So those are some things that have changed. And of course, social media and the internet has been, the force multiplier. I've seen that evolve throughout my career and gave a real boost to the networking capabilities, the violence, the targeting ability by using, you know, all kinds of apps and programs that are out there. So those are the three things I would say that's changed, that's really boosted these violent capabilities and led to increased recruitment and radicalization. On the far left, what's interesting there is I would take it back further than the Israeli-Hamas war that's going on. I would go all the way back to like 2016, 2017, where we saw a kind of a flurry of violent or controversial shootings of unarmed black men. And of course, this was magnified up in Minneapolis in 2020, and we had nationwide, you know, riots, and extremists on both sides infiltrated the cover of those riots to, you know, further their agendas. So what we need to be worried about, what we're missing, and I will say that since January 6, 21, I'm happy to see that there's been a lot of grant money put out into the academic community. There's been expertise building up, which we didn't have in 2009, quite frankly. So that's a positive, but we're playing catch up. I mean, these groups, particularly on the far right and now the far left, have had over a decade of momentum to recruit, radicalize, mobilize on all the violent attacks that we've been seeing. So on the far left, something that, you know, I guess concerns me is the fact that we're not, a lot of people aren't recognizing that the far left threat is growing. We're in the midst of a growth period. And I would attribute it to not only most recently with the war over in Israel, but also those police shootings, and lastly, this counter-mobilization to the far right being so, their growth and momentum. So they're arming themselves in response to a perceived threat from the far right, and you're seeing these violent clashes between the far right and the far left whenever we have these rallies, whether it's around mask mandates or whether it's some other type of protest that's going on. We have these street brawls that break out, shootings have happened, stabbings. And so those are some of the things I think we're missing. The far right infiltration all the way up to the federal level. People with clearances have been arrested on terrorism charges that belong to white supremacy and anti-government groups. And then, of course, the far left, the growing threat. Nobody's talking about it. So I did write a recent piece to try to, you know, shine the spotlight on the growing far left threat. Again, you can find that on the New Lines website.
Thank you both for helping us start to see that we might have a challenge coming from the far left as well. I want to explore something, Julia, you started to bring out. If we have such an increase in violence, like if you just look at any of the stats, we've been on an upward trajectory for at least 10 years. We have some polls, Chicago Post Center has been doing a series of polls since January 6th, and we have 10%, this is as of June, 10% of Americans are willing to commit an act of violence to prevent Trump from taking office, and 7% are willing to commit an act of violence to help Trump regain the presidency, which I thought was quite interesting to see that you actually had a higher percentage coming from the anti-Trump side. You have 33% of Americans, give or take, depending on the poll, who believe that political violence is sometimes okay. Violence is sometimes okay to achieve your political end. It's like 88 million Americans. So we have this cognitive opening to violence as a country. What's undergirding in us? What is leading us to a place where we are more open to violence as a solution to our problems? And is it really the ideology?
It's a really good point. And again, sorry about that. Yeah, no, I think also the point that you just made is really relevant for that, because I think what we're seeing is a form of tit-for-tat extremism or reciprocal radicalization. Actually, my first book, The Rage, which I wrote about the interaction, and you alluded to that in the first question, which I didn't address, but was about the interactions between far-right and jihadist forms of extremism and violence, and this form of reciprocal radicalization that we saw happening a lot in the aftermath of the ISIS-inspired attacks that were happening in Europe, but also in the US, where the far-right could really tap into those fears in the wider populations and fuel more anti-Muslim resentment off the back of that. And vice versa, ISIS and the jihadist movements could then use the anti-Muslim resentments and the discrimination experiences that Muslims made in everyday life to then push back and say, no, actually the West has staged a war on us, and the far right said Islam has staged a war against us. So it was a very similar narrative that we saw here, and I think we are seeing something very similar now happening between far right and far left, where they also have this idea of a looming civil war or of a kind of an inevitable escalation of the dynamics, and both blame each other and also manage to mobilize off the back of each other's activities. But that brings us to the point of this is not really something that is based on ideology, because we have some very common pillars that are the key pillars of different ideologies, whether we look at the jihadist movements, at the far right or the far left, and a lot of this is based on this idea of an inevitable war. And what's more interesting even, I find, is that we also see a psychological phenomenon and group dynamics that are emerging as a pattern in all of these movements. So in my studies at the University of Oxford, I did a terrorist manifesto analysis where I tried to find statistically significant patterns in the communications of people who really go all the way to using violent attacks, and kind of try to distinguish between what is actually, what makes someone go all the way to committing an attack on behalf of their in-group. And what I find the most relevant pattern was that all of these people were basically experiencing something called identity fusion, where their personal identity had become one with the group identity. So this identity fusion phenomenon there is actually a lot of research that came out in the last 2 decades from the fields of cognitive and evolutionary anthropology and social psychology, where that's been tied to a much higher willingness of highly fused individuals to commit attacks, to even commit martyrdom or suicide operations if that comes at a high risk to self, to their own survival or to their own political career. Especially when they perceive their fused group as existentially threatened from an outside group that's then demonized and dehumanized. So this identity fusion phenomenon is something that we're seeing a lot now, because not only is it directly tied to a much higher risk of violence, but the way that it emerges is usually via shared dysphoric experiences, via shared traumatic or negative experiences with the group. So in the current context, for example, the Gaza conflict really creates very strong identity fusion, of course, on both sides, as it would always do in a war. Both sides have really deeply transformative and traumatic in-group experiences. And this is now, because of social media, this phenomenon is no longer just confined to the war zones, but it's something where we see similar effects through the sharing of images and of basically terrible war scenes and stories and anecdotes from the people who are there, that people are affected in countries that are very far away from the war zones. And that's something that is extremely dangerous, because it also means that the willingness to commit violence on behalf of your group that you perceive as threatened and that you start to perceive as being part of your own identity, of being basically your family. These people would use very often familiar language to refer to other members of the in-group. And that means you go all in for the group. And we see that in various contexts. I just mentioned the Gaza conflict because, of course, that's a very timely and a very relevant escalation mechanism for these tit-for-tat dynamics. But we also see it in the context of course, the radical pro-Trump supporters and the anti-Trump case, that could actually turn into something that could potentially be quite toxic and give rise to really strong tit-for-tat dynamics. So yeah, I think it's worth looking at that. Identity fusion, just to mention it briefly, but on its own is not dangerous. Most of us are fused with our families and would do everything to save our relatives' lives by donating a kidney or even jumping on a bomb if necessary. But when it's in combination with this existential threat to the in-group and this dehumanization of an entire out-group, then it can be potentially something that is quite toxic. Yeah.
Thank you, Julia. Jacob, I think one of the other things you draw out in your book, and certainly every time we are processing the latest attack, is how young some of our attackers are. What's going on there? Why? Can you solve this problem for us? And I'm joking. I know that it's a complex answer here. Why are we seeing so many young people drawn into terrorism?
I don't know. I remember when I first started noticing this issue, panicking about it with my colleague Farah Pandith, who's going to be speaking later today. We were concerned about people, kind of young adults, right, 17, 18, 19. That has changed now. We're talking about 12, 13, 14-year-olds. I would imagine that some of the other things that we speak about, social media especially, leaderless resistance, the concept of ideological convergence, right? The ideologies that we're talking about here aren't really that coherent anymore, cohesive. I think that's probably connected to it, and driving people to be younger. I think everything that that Julie just explained about the fusion element. A lot of these people, they're not just young, they have other vulnerabilities. So mental illness, violence or trauma in the home, romantic frustration, sometimes substance abuse. All of those things are leading people, I think probably, Julie, make them more attracted to this fused identity with a group because it can replace some of those personal traumas. Those are all hypotheses, Elizabeth. I don't know. There's a cliche counterterrorism people love, and you've all heard it. We heard it several times yesterday. Right, the alarms are flashing red. This, I think, is the 5-alarm fire. It's children, and most of us want to conceptualize, I think, counterterrorism in kind of a government or intelligence law enforcement way. This is not. It cannot be a government law enforcement intelligence a problem. I think it was Deputy Commissioner Winey yesterday said it's a public health issue, and we have to think about what it means to, like, dramatically raise our public health work on this issue, because it's an enormous vulnerability, and we don't, from what I can tell, we don't have a response.
And that is a great lead-in to our final question that I'm going to ask each of you to respond to in the remaining time we have. Following our panel are two former heads of the National Counterterrorism Center. So I want you to answer the question as if you had the opportunity to inform government policy. Do we have the tools we need for this fight? And I will take the moderator's prerogative and say, we've spent 23 years investing in intelligence, military, and law enforcement, and my gosh, we are good. And thank God we are good, because we only have one 9/11 memorial, and not many across the country. So thank God that we were good at preventing the next 9/11. But we're all here today because we don't think the fight is won. Where do we now need to move to address this problem of increasing youth radicalization, an embrace of violence as a solution to our problems? What does the government need to be doing? What do other parts of society need to be doing? Michael, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm going to answer your question within the context of my focus, the anti-fascists and the anarchists. I think the main thing that we're missing at this point is just a lack of understanding. I mean, rightfully, our focus has been on other threat actors. You look at the level of lethality, number of attacks, that's entirely warranted. I get that. But it's come at a cost, I think, of having even a basic, I don't know, maybe that's too much, but a sufficient understanding of what we're dealing with at the other end of the spectrum. It's really hard to get, you know, research money to support work in this area. It's not sexy. It's not what folks want to fund and learn about. So I think that that's something that needs to be rectified. I'm not worried about you guys. I mean, like you have the tools, you have the techniques, you have the resources to handle it. Again, I don't want to overstate, the threat. I'm not trying to do that, but I do think we need to understand it better than we currently do.
Yeah. Perhaps picking up on the youth radicalization point and going to solutions from there, I think one of the key issues is, of course, vulnerabilities have been very high, but I think that's not something entirely new. I think young people are almost always vulnerable to being exploited and being groomed and radicalized. But what we see now is that the ways in which extremist movements and recruiters can tap into young audiences have changed, because it's much more effective now, obviously via social media, especially with emerging tactics of gamified communication, subcultures, exclusive subcultures that are emerging, and where they can also easily connect with those personal grievances, connect the personal grievances of individuals to tailored solutions of collective narratives, where this creates this cognitive opening and identity fusion being able to form on a much bigger level in those online communities and online groups. I think the solution to that is on various different levels that we haven't been tackling so far. I think identity fusion is definitely a factor that I'd love to, where I see a lot of potential to use that as a starting point. It's only one out of many factors in the radicalization process, but I think we haven't really started to tackle that yet in de-radicalization or even in prevention efforts, to try to defuse people, for example, by exposing them to unshared experiences with their in-group with other members of the in-group. Some of the de-radicalization initiatives already do that, but also exposing them to the suffering of the perceived enemy groups or the perceived out groups. That can actually, we used to talk about black and white narratives and how this can tear apart these black and white narratives, but I think essentially it can also disrupt these extremely powerful group dynamics. And the other dimension is, I think, we need more awareness raising at the intersection of psychology and digital literacy. I think digital literacy is much more than what we're currently treating as digital literacy in the curriculum, as in being able to distinguish between disinformation and credible sources of information. We're very far away from being able to do that even, but I think it's much more also about being able to reflect on one's own role in the digital sphere and how one can be easily manipulated, how psychological phenomena and group dynamics can be accelerated and become even more toxic in online communities.
Thank you, Julia. Daryl, real quickly.
The first thing is the obvious. Our leadership in this country needs to call out these acts as terrorism. Okay? Then we need to collect data from an official government agency, the FBI, needs to collect that data, publish it, make it public like they used to do with their Terrorism in the United States public report. But the two big areas that people probably wouldn't consider as areas that we need to focus on, I would say exit programs. Europe has had a long, successful history of implementing these counter-radicalization programs by having former extremists reach out to extremists that are embedded and bring them out of those movements. We had a kind of a haphazard attempt to do that with Christian Picciolini's Life After Hate group. Funding got pulled immediately after the election. We haven't scratched the surface on exit programs. And as I said, Europe has a 25-year history and a pretty darn good success rate. The last thing is school programs. I volunteer at an organization called We Are Many United Against Hate based out of Wisconsin, and the leader, Masood Akhtar, has put together a school program where they form these anti-hate, anti-bias student groups within high schools and colleges. And it's starting to pick up steam in the Midwest, in Wisconsin in particular, but I think that program needs to be rolled out nationally. Yeah, we have organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center and ADL that have these little booklets and maybe even a course that they could go train people, but these are civil rights organizations that have agendas to it as well. So to have a non-profit organization with no agenda other than to eradicate hate, I think is a perfect organization to fund and a program to implement.
Thank you, Daryl. Jacob, like 15 seconds,
Real
unfortunately.
quick, let me go back to a question you answered earlier. Why is violence so high? I think there are forces in our country who have conditioned us, trained us to believe that a certain baseline of violence is acceptable for constitutional freedoms. I say this as a victim myself, as a survivor of gun violence. We do not have to accept that baseline of violence anymore. It's not something that we have to accept for the right to live in this country. So I would say we need to make progress on capability. We need to make progress on firearms.
Thank you. And will you give a round of applause to our panelists?